I felt a lot of the typical academic stress that we talk about, feeling like we have to pursue this constant academic validation because we're in this culture that really thrives off of us, feeling like we need to constantly achieve and reach this bar that's always being set higher and higher and higher and higher. And I really didn't do a good job of counteracting that in high school. And I think I'm going to be so transparent about the fact that I'm human and I'm still working through that right now. In college, it's hard not to, feel like the world is crashing down when I didn't get the grade that I wanted on a paper I worked very hard on.
Welcome to Make Today Well Live podcast. This month is our stress management month, and I am Mia Shapiro.
And I am Reese Margot, and we are so happy to have you here for our Season 4, Episode 4 podcast.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
Tell us about yourself and the different organizations you're a part of.
Yeah, totally. So my name is Sophie Shev. I'm a sophomore currently at Stanford University, BHHS ILC alum, so super happy to be back. And yeah, so I've been doing mental health advocacy, I think kind of on the more professional level for about 3 years now. I've worked with numerous organizations in the nonprofit sector, but also kind of doing more political work and just my own organizing. But just to kind of name a few and talk about the work that I've done, I was a youth advisor for the Born This Way Foundation, as well as Mental Health America, and I'm currently on the youth advisory board for NAMI, called NAMI Next Gen, and NAMI is a National Alliance on Mental Illness, and they kind of contribute a lot to the country's mental health policy agenda, providing resources for people across the mental health spectrum. They really do a whole lot. They're one of the biggest mental health orgs out there, and that's my current role right now. I also serve as the Director of Mental Health and Wellbeing at the Stanford Executive Cabinet, so that means I kind of oversee mental health and well-being for the entire undergraduate population. So a lot of that kind of looks like negotiating with staff and providing more resources for students on campus, listening to students' needs, what they need out there, what kinds of resources would be helpful, what's not helpful. And I've also done quite a bit of my own advocacy and storytelling and public speaking. So I was at the White House in May of 2022 with the Mental Health Youth Action Forum with MTV. And that was a really cool opportunity. I got to meet the president and kind of share a little bit about my mental health story and kind of what young people out there need. And that was just a super, super cool experience to really have a seat at a table that young people have long been excluded from. And I've also, done my own storytelling and testified in front of the California State Senate Judiciary Committee for a bill. It was called SB 680, which would basically hold social media companies accountable for knowingly and negligently harming young people, was the language that we use. So basically, causing addiction, leading to suicide attempts, self-harm behaviors, eating disorders, all that. So yeah, I'm just super... very much an open book, very excited to be here and kind of share a little bit more about the advocacy side of things, the personal side of things, and also just give general advice for mental health, but also for mental health advocates and anyone that's looking to do advocacy in that space. And again, super thankful to NormanAid and just school counseling centers like this that provide a safe space for students, because I think that's where so much of the mental health crisis is currently being mitigated, is through young people building connections with each other, with peer counselors like you guys, with very understanding and kind staff members. So super excited to be a part of this.
We were wondering where your passion for spreading mental health came from.
Yeah, so definitely came from a place of personal experience with mental health injustice in the mental health care system. I'm very much an open book about my experiences being institutionalized and kind of going through that. So when I was, I think 14, I was diagnosed with an eating disorder, but I'm someone that grew up in a larger body. And because of that, I really couldn't access a lot of the life-saving treatment that I needed, and was pretty close to death at one point. And it was a very scary time for me. It was a very scary time for my family. And I kind of realized that a lot of the lack of treatment that I was getting was because of just rules that were created on very old ancient systems that have never really been changed, never really been reckoned with. The fact that insurance cuts people off for eating disorder treatment based on weight makes absolutely no sense, because research has shown that eating disorders are not correlated with having a certain body size at all. And even, you know, reckoning with that really took a toll on my mental health. I realized how widespread the injustices are out there. And I was in a very lucky, privileged position. I mean, my family was still able to pay for treatment despite that happening. But so many people out there don't have that opportunity, don't have that access. And I feel very lucky to be here, to be alive, to be able to share my story, to be able to spread awareness, and to be able to, you know, create a drive for change among other young people. But really why I do this is because, because of the personal experiences and struggles that I had, but also how healing that advocacy was in that space. When I was really, really struggling, I actually began writing poetry about my experiences. I built a connection with my English teacher at the time, who was undergoing cancer treatment. Her name was Miss Mansfield. And we kind of formed a pen palship from our respective hospital beds and wrote poetry to each other. And that was really how I discovered advocacy. A lot of people don't think of art and poetry and creative writing as activism, as social justice, but for me it really was. It was a way of reckoning with the injustices I was facing, a way of finding humanity and finding connection to myself in a space where I was so often being seen as a diagnosis rather than a human being, as a set of numbers rather than a whole human person with a personality and wants and needs and desires and aspirations. I think that's really what kind of took me out of that really negative headspace, was being able to self-express. And eventually that self-expression kind of grew into more, I think, solidified advocacy. Like I said, you know, testifying in front of Congress, writing more explicitly about the injustices that exist, talking with more young people, forming coalitions, building solidarity, collective storytelling, that whole shebang. But yeah, I think it definitely evolved out of number one, personal experience and personal pain, but also finding art and beauty out of that pain, and just, finding a lot of connection to my own self-expression through that.
That's amazing. So clearly you didn't really have a very average high school experience. No. Since it's stress like management, what would you say are some stressors that you dealt with that you would say a lot of people can relate to?
Yeah,
I mean, how you dealt with them.
Totally. I think even though I didn't have a traditional high school experience by any means, I essentially had to drop out in the middle of the 10th grade to be hospitalized. Before that, and even afterwards, I felt a lot of the typical academic stress that we talk about, feeling like we have to pursue this constant academic validation because we're in this culture that really thrives off of us, feeling like we need to constantly achieve and reach this bar that's always being set higher and higher and higher and higher. And I really didn't do a good job of counteracting that in high school. And I think I'm going to be so transparent about the fact that I'm human, and I'm still working through that right now. In college, it's hard not to, feel like the world is crashing down when I didn't get the grade that I wanted on a paper I worked very hard on, or when I feel like my professor misunderstood one of, the arguments that I was making. It's a hard thing to work through, but I think a lot of that is kind of realizing, okay, we live in a system where our value is being placed on achievement, and that needs to be reckoned with. But in the meantime, we can reckon with that individually and kind of find value and find purpose in things other than that academic achievement. So for me, that looked like scheduling time every single week to just do something fun with my friends. Like, we call it our Thursday night drives. We'll just go somewhere random, in and out, Topgolf, whatever. We'll just go on a drive and kind of de-stress from all of that academic pressure that we're constantly facing. And I found so much comfort and purpose in my friendships and in my connections. And part of that was also continuing to write and continuing to self-express and create art and poetry, not for anyone's sake, but for mine, just for my own mental health and for my own self-exploration and identity building. I think that's the most helpful piece of advice that I can give to high schoolers and college students, and really anyone that's dealing with that academic stress, is to find value elsewhere and to find value in things that genuinely make you happy.
So how did the stress impact you while you were in high school and kind of working around those stress parts?
Yeah, I definitely think, again, my high school experience was not traditional at all. But yeah, at the time, I definitely think the stress contributed to my deteriorating mental health. It was that kind of thing where I had to drop out because of health reasons. I felt completely lost, like I had no identity at all, because I'd put all of my identity into my schoolwork, into the sport that I played. I really didn't have anything else to hold on to make me feel like a person. I just felt like I was simply overtaken by an illness. And that made it very, very difficult, which is why it's so important to kind of spread out, don't put all your eggs in one basket, kind of like spread them out. For me, part of like my recovery journey and part of like my own mental health and self-care is making sure that like my identity exists in different facets of my life. So I definitely think the academic stress and like just how much that contributed to my own self-image really did contribute to that deterioration. And I also, learned a lot from it, going into college, kind of being back in a more traditional school setting. I kind of feel like I have a second shot, kind of a way of doing it over. And like, yes, I do tend to get very stressed out by schoolwork. I'm pulling a lot more all-nighters than I'd like to say that I am. But at the same time, I am very aware I have to work on it. I'm very aware that I have other aspects of my personality that matter as well. If I end up getting a B on a paper when I thought I deserved an A, it's not the end of the world. That's not all I have to cling on to. I have other things that make me valuable as a person, and also it led me to kind of reckon with why we put so much value on our grades. At the end of the day, it's just like that culture, that achievement culture that we're all a part of, that part of like, okay, you need to be the perfect student so you can be the perfect worker, so you can have the perfect life, so you can make X amount of money, so you could give it to your children, etc. And it's like, okay, but where does my happiness and my fulfillment and my sense of community and my sense of identity and my sense of love for myself and for others factor into that? And ultimately, it does not take that into account. So you have to take it into account for yourself. And I think that's a lot of the work that I'm doing right now. It's like, where do I find value, and kind of reckoning with that, and discovering that and exploring that and encouraging others to do the same.
As we come to finals, what are some tips that you would give for students struggling to deal with stress?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I need to take this into account myself too, because I'm currently working on all my final papers, even though it is Thanksgiving break. But yeah, I would say, like, of course it's important to have that time to work, to have that time to study, approach that with whatever care that you need, but also build out time in your day for what I call productive breaks. My friend has this saying, which like I want to amplify, like I love him to death. He says, rest is a human right and not a reward for labor. And I think that's like just so poignant and beautiful. Like, you deserve rest no matter how much work you got done, even if you really didn't do everything you had hoped to accomplish that day, you didn't do all the studying you had hoped to have done. Rest can actually be very productive, and rest can be, a way to, again, take care of yourself in a society and an environment that really doesn't care if you take care of yourself or not. So yeah, cut out time to do things that you love. If that means art and self-expression, it means art and self-expression. If it means, spending time with siblings, with friends, with family, quietly reflecting, journaling, even watching TV, like, that's okay. We need to kind of like destigmatize this whole idea of laziness, because in my view, laziness doesn't really exist. It's a response to being overworked. And a lot of times we are overworked and don't even realize it. Being overworked doesn't have to look like studying and studying until you fall asleep in your desk. Sometimes being overworked looks like simply getting through the day when you're having a hard time battling with, depressive thoughts. It simply means continuing to interact with people even though you feel like you have to put on a mask sometimes, and it can be exhausting. Burnout is a very, very real thing, and that's why I kind of like to replace the word laziness with burnout. And the only way to combat that is to let yourself rest. So I just like really want to emphasize and like destigmatize that resting piece. And also, don't be afraid to learn things in ways that make sense for you. Like, I'm very passionate about creating accessible classroom environments for students that have learning disabilities, that learn in different ways. And a lot of times classrooms aren't accessible nowadays, so you kind of, unfortunately, have to find ways around that and make it accessible to yourself. And, like, find ways to study that are the least stressful to you. Like, to me, literally like staring at a page and rereading and like writing everything down is so stressful, but explaining concepts in conversation with my family makes so much sense to my brain, and it's such an easier way for me to study. It takes so much less stress. So like in that, I really encourage students to kind of find ways to study that feels less stressful to them, because A, you'll be less miserable, but B, you're more likely to learn that in a way that makes more sense to your brain. You're more likely to actually retain that information and perform better. But also, it's important to take the onus off of performing all the time. So yeah, it's kind of like that double-edged sword where you have to like really walk a fine line of like, make sure you're prioritizing yourself and taking care of yourself, and in understanding that there's certain things we need to do it in a way that is most accessible to you.
What are you planning on doing in like the future when you're done with college?
Okay, good question. I'm still figuring that out as well. But I am very passionate about mental health advocacy and community organizing, and kind of working within systems to redefine them and kind of make them more just and accessible. So I kind of hope to stay in that sphere of like mental health policy. I currently am serving as a political appointee for the Substance Administration. I am currently serving as a National Advisory Council member for the Substance Use and Mental Health Services Administration, and that's something I definitely hope to continue pursuing after college, kind of working within the sphere of like the federal government or even local government to continue to kind of bring that lived experience expertise to the table and amplify the voices of, you know, young people that have dealt with mental health challenges, but also, just like really putting a focus on like, we need to bring our own voice to the table because the policy that is being created without us there to witness it happening, and it affects us so deeply, and it affected, you know, my 15-year-old self in that hospital so deeply. So that's really something I hope to continue to pursue after college. Not sure if it's going to look like, you know, getting a master's or going to law school or what that whole academic path will look like, but I definitely do hope to end up on the policy realm, like doing actual mental health legislation.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that with us. And is there anything else that you would like to share with us?
It is very important to take these individual actions to protect our own mental health, but we cannot lose sight of the fact that it is not our fault that we are struggling, because we do live within systems that almost benefit off of our struggles, that do not care about our mental health. And we have to continue to do what I call revisioning, like RE-visioning. It's a term that feminist writer Adrienne Rich came up with. I encourage everyone to read her work. But yeah, it's kind of like this concept of like imagining a world where our mental health is really prioritized. And, you know, it can be an exhausting task, which is why it's so important to talk about it with your peers. Like, you'd be so surprised at how many people can relate to feeling so, like, bogged down by these systems, feeling like their own well-being isn't being accounted for and isn't being centered. And unfortunately, the only way to counteract that is to talk about it, to find the language for it. And I'm so proud of our generation for really starting to do that. Like, we're, you know, hearing young kids use words like intergenerational trauma, like culturally competent care, that our parents and grandparents did not ever, you know, understand. They did not have access to that language. So kind of the more that we can talk about it, the more that we can find language for it, the more that we can start to really revision those systems. And that's work that we shouldn't lose sight of. But first things first is you can't do that unless you're taking care of your own mental health to a certain extent. So yeah, kind of keep both of those things in mind as you navigate the world as a young person in a very, very chaotic environment.
We would like to thank our generous sponsors and partners, Michael J. LeBeau, NormanAid Peer Counselors, KBEV, and of course, we'd like to thank our listeners. Stay safe and make today well lived.